Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second roundtable of the Slave, Citizen, Human Graduate Student Colloquium in Slavery. Our second roundtable will have presenters Chris Dingwall and Michael Sawyer. Chris Dingwall is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Chicago. His dissertation, Selling Slavery, Memory, Culture, and the Renewal of America, 1876 to 1920, shows how Americans constructed their relationship to the modern through the production and consumption of mass-produced images of slavery, from magazine literature to early cinema to mechanical toys. At Chicago, Chris has been a member of the Mapping the Stacks archival project and the Object Cultures project. He is curating Race and the Design of American Life, African Americans in the 20th Century Commercial Art, an exhibition now open at the University of Chicago's Special Collections Gallery. His paper title today is Reanimating Slavery, Mechanical Toys, Human Machines, and the Play of Race. Michael Sawyer is a PhD student at Brown University in Africana Studies and is also pursuing an MA in Comparative Literature. He is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy with a BS in Political Science and holds an MA in International Relations from the University of Chicago. He is currently visiting lecturer of Political Science and African American Diasporic Studies at Wheaton College. His paper title today is Fanon's Theory of Subaltern Self-Consciousness, Political Space, Coercion, Imagination, Persona. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. I just want to, let's get a bit bigger for me. I just want to thank the Center for Slavery and Justice for having me. This is just a really wonderful program. And I also want to preface this talk by saying that we'll be presenting and sort of lingering on a lot of hateful things, racist, hateful objects, and I want to make sure I was very careful to do this in a scholarly way, and I'm also going to be using some language, racist, hateful language, again. Because they're in my sources, and also with the understanding that they refer, ultimately not to African Americans, but to what Du Bois called the souls of white folk. So with that preface in mind, I'll begin. To understand how modern Americans experienced their freedom at the dawn of the 20th century, we should think about the triumph of a mechanical dancing. Sorry. To understand how modern Americans experienced their freedom at the dawn of the 20th century, we should think about the triumph of a mechanical dancing slave. Tombo, the Alabama coonjigger, was among the best-selling toys of the 1915 Christmas shopping season and remained so well into the 1920s. Even John Wanamaker, retailer extraordinaire, ran out of stock and was caught off guard in his flagship Philadelphia department store. Tombo's success might be easily explained as an automatic reflex of white racism. Mechanical toys like Tombo were hardly new to American consumers. Negro jig dancers were staples of the domestic mechanical toy market since the Civil War, and its roots could be traced back to the racialized automata hawked by high-end toy sellers and traveling showmen even earlier. And of course, racist characters saturated nearly every facet of popular culture at the turn of the century, especially children's dolls and picture books, all of which drew from the iconography of the blackface minstrel show. And of course, we should remember that the year of Tombo was also the year of the birth of the nation. So Tombo joined a teeming menagerie of racist playthings under the Christmas tree in 1915, Little Black Sambo books, Topsy dolls, mechanical banks, all of which appeal to children and parents seeking nostalgic refuge from the trials of modernity and sustenance for the white supremacy. Yet Tombo was different. In this paper, I argue that Tombo was not only a reflection of racist ideology, it used race as a material expression of an incorporating industrial economy, one that was remaking the American workplace, home and body, with automated things like assembly lines, vacuum cleaners, and Model T Fords, and an economy that was crystallizing at the moment of the First World War. Tombo was at home among these modern machines, but dressed in the garb of a black-faced minstrel, it also crystallized a deeper association between race and technology, with roots in antebellum debates about slavery and freedom. Thus, Tombo helps us see the era around 1915 marked by taylorization at home and the specter of industrial warfare abroad, as a moment when Americans were adjusting the sense and scale of their freedom in relation to new and often alienating relationships with machines. Tombaugh sold a sense of freedom, I will suggest, by marketing the difference between human and machine with race. White master human, black slave machine. This race work naturalized especially the coercive powers of state and capital over the body as something that was fun. So in other words, what's at stake for me here is not only racial identity, but how race is used to form and give shape to social formations, such as industrial capitalism. So as historians such as David Blight and Nina Silber have shown, Americans in the early 20th century were accustomed to think about slavery nostalgically, as a pastoral and pre-modern old plantation. Yet Tombaugh points to a different strain of memory in which slavery and modernity were entwined. We can see from advertisements that Tombaugh did not mean to neatly juxtapose or contrast slavery and technology. It jumbled the two together. So here in these quotes, I've sort of highlighted references to mechanisms in red, to body and or to motion in blue, to the body in green, sort of as a way of showing how jumbled up it was. So Tombaugh was both a stereotypical quote coon and a quote realistic dancing Negro. It referenced an image of African Americans wedded to an idyllic memory of slavery, forever quote going through the motions of a Southern plantation dance. Advertisers, however, also presented Tombaugh as a novelty and harped on popular appetites for gadgets and mechanical contrivance. Indeed, Tombaugh was promised to imitate, even excel, human dancing. According to its advertisements, Tombaugh's wind-up mechanism would entrance children with an endless variety of steps, which, quote, far excels the best efforts of even the most professional dancers. For all their attention to the toy's lifelike appearance and natural colors, advertisements unveiled its hidden mechanism. Quote, you only have to wind up the very powerful spring mechanism and the coon will shake his legs in the most amazing way. The most perfect time is preserved, and by adjusting the regulation device, the coon can be made to dance fast or slow. In other words, Tombaugh was a representation of a real, natural, lifelike, quote, coon. It was also a regulated, responsive, and precise machine. It was an antebellum darky. It was the champion dancer of the world. So Tombaugh was not the old-time slave yearned for by mass audiences that saw D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation that was then, too, drawing in the millions. Though we should also remember that the success of this film also conjoined nostalgic racism with Griffith's own mastery of the modern motion picture machine. But to understand the meaning and power of its jumbled reference to slavery and technology requires surveying quickly a persistent yet paradoxical figure with deep roots in American culture, what I would call the slave machine. The coming of such a mechanical man had stalked American culture since the early Republic. A figure which offered motion free of volition, the mechanical man held the utopian promise of human emancipation from labor. But as a violation of Republican virtues of self-reliance and self-proprietorship, it also stood as a specter of future slavery for the Republic. During the mounting slavery crisis of the 1840s and 50s, thinkers and culture producers turned the figure of the machine to judge the differences between slavery and freedom. Abolitionists like Theodore Parker and transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson, for instance, could frame Yankee machinery as a counterpoint to slavery. Meanwhile, the Southern planter class imagined themselves on the vanguard of modern progress because their factories were their fields and their machines were their slaves. For its part, the Blackface Minstrel Show exploited the ambiguity of the figure of the slave machine. Amid songs which presented slave life as a pre-industrial idyll, blackface minstrels in northern cities would also imitate the steam whistles and train engines and share the stage with mechanical black automatons. In Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, abolitionist author Harriet Beecher Stowe brought these tensions to a head by distinguishing the good machines of capitalism from the bad machines of slavery. In the figure of Topsy in particular, Stowe endowed a peculiar life to the slave machine that would gain a powerful purchase on consumer society after slavery. In Topsy, Stowe's portrait of slavery's inhumanity ran deeper than human commodification. Stowe draws the reader's attention to Topsy's, quote, round shining eyes glittering as glass beads, quote, the black glassy eyes glittering with a kind of wicked drollery, quote, the eyes twinkling as she spoke. What first appears as, quote, something odd and goblin-like about her appearance, something heathenish, Stowe further specifies as something machine-like. When her master, Sinclair, orders Topsy to, quote, give us a song now and show us something of your dancing, she obeys like a dog, but also responds like a machine. Topsy turns on her operator's volition and turns off suddenly by returning to a state of perfect immobility. She produces odd sounds which at once signal a deep racial memory of dancing, but also imitates a, quote, unearthly steam whistle. She is a thing struck up, her cunning glances revealing not quite a hidden humanity, but rather the uncanniness of inhuman automation behind glass eyes. So before the boom in mechanical toys in the 1860s, Stowe described Topsy as if she were already a doll. The perfect product of slavery's form of human reproduction, something neither born nor made, Topsy became the perfect commodity for an emerging culture of mechanical reproduction. After abolition, Topsys proliferated in the emerging institutions of American mass culture as a figure to describe the border between the animate thing and the mechanized person. From magic lantern slides and automated window displays to even used as a derogatory term to describe white saleswomen in department stores. Stowe endowed Topsy was a thing for sale as well as a machine that made sales. And this is something I found to illustrate this point from Yale's Beinecke collection. It's a magic lantern slide, and you can see it was meant to slide in and out to give a sense of animation. She was also an image at the border between life and death. In a short film, which I won't show here, called Electrocuting an Elephant, produced by Thomas Edison in 1903, Topsy the elephant demonstrated the power of mass culture to animate death. And this is a film where a giant elephant was brought out to show how dangerous AC current electricity was by basically just electrocuting a gigantic elephant. I'll spare you that. Topsy, in other words, resolved the shifting boundaries between real and artificial life with the boundaries of racial difference, then solidifying in Jim Crow America. As Jacqueline Goldsby suggests, the liminality of figures like Topsy made an oblique but knowing reference to the lynching of real black people. Indeed, we can say that race was used here to reinforce the blurring lines between the real life enjoyed by whiteness and the animate death that doomed blackness. This difference was no more visible than in the mechanical toy market, where the referent to racial slavery regulated the relationship between the children's minds and the ideas in mechanical toys. So in their heyday, the mass-produced toy market, or mechanical toy, was seen as a harbinger of a new culture of mechanical reproduction, a machine culture. They were celebrated as a sign of American technological genius and feared as a step towards human mechanization. According to the Ladies' Home Journal in 1905, the purchase of a toy became a moment for consumers to reassert traditional values against the mechanization of children. Quote, the nervous unrest of our time is showing in our children, and their toy department is one little place where we may put down the brakes. Instead of buying playthings as modern, as elaborate, as finished, and as mechanical as possible, let us rather study and to find simpler toys, those which will cause the child to use his imagination as well as the toy for this real play. But while critics want to preserve the barrier between children's imaginations and the nervousness, if you will, of a machine, the boosters of machine culture promoted new mechanical toys by emphasizing their very capacity to gather children into relationships with machines. In its coverage of the American toy industry in 1868, Scientific American praised mechanical toys like, quote, the Negro jig dancer, because they sated the child's taste to striving after the actual. And what was actual about the mechanical dancer was not that the real life it supposedly imitated, but its real machinery, its, quote, mechanical movements, which were, quote, a means of instructing children in the principles of mechanicals, and therefore dispelled the fear of machines as a dreadful agent of evil. So practically all the new toys Harper's Bazaar declared in 1907 are toys with ideas. In the case of the Negro jig dancer and the mechanical black minstrels that followed it, the idea was both a reference to race and the actual mechanical principles that animated it. This dualism helped to render benign the intrusion of mechanical principles into children's minds. Of course, not all mechanical toys were black, and in press coverage and in advertisements, the black toys did not receive precedence over others. Yet they kept particular company. In one, a mechanical cakewalk toy was presented alongside a mechanical monkey, clown, and acrobats. A minstrel named only Mechanical Dancer and a black mammy named only Mechanical Nurse shared space with a mechanical bear, mechanical mule clowns, and mechanical fire engine. In all cases, manufacturers hedged the alien quality of automated life with the allure of the fantastic, the animalistic, and the racial other. They staged the vivification of the machine with the magic possessed of the non-human or semi-human things. So one among dozens then, toy designer Walter S. Hendren imagined his toy in the garb of a plantation minstrel, but described the mechanics in technical abstraction and crude commercialism. And this is from his patent for the toy. As he says, it is capable of furnishing to a child an unlimited amount of amusement. Even without overt references to race in his text, Hendren hinted at what must have been at the heart of the presumably automatic association between his toy and the accompanying illustration of paired black dancers. And as you can see, like, the language here, reads like, stereo instructions. They're just so abstract. But as he goes on, the mechanism, he says, would impart dance-like movements to the figure. But so did the will of the operator regulate the speed of the dance. So here, an automated figure was made a real slave beholden to the will of a child. And in 1910, the Ferdinand Strauss Manufacturing Company duly bought this patent and marketed it as Tombo, the Alabama Coonjigger. But it did not become a hit until 1915, and I think here the coming of World War is important. For the obvious reason, or for a primary reason, that it changed the toy industry and the toy economy. At first, the outbreak of war was a boon to the American toy industry because cheap German-made mechanical toys that dominated U.S. markets since 1900 stopped. War halted all German war production and their foreign export, while American toy makers seized the moment and captured a wide-open marketplace. So before 1915, American toy makers sort of had a marginal place in the American toy marketplace. And when Germany entered the war, or when America entered the war against Germany, compelling other industries to revert to war production, toy makers protected their industry by banding together as the toy manufacturers of the United States, by declaring their toys essential to the war effort, because what else would train the engineers, the scientists, and the marksmen of the future? They successfully lobbied Congress for exemption from wartime rationing and for strict tariffs on future toy imports. Drafting off these favorable winds, Tombo's manufacturer, Ferdinand Strauss, incorporated his business and proclaimed himself the founder of the mechanical toy industry in America. By 1923, he was selling 3,600,000 mechanical toys per year. Tombo was the face of the line. Indeed, for a moment, Tombo became kind of a war toy. Between advertisements for Tinker Toys and militarized erector sets, both of which were also invented around the same time, the Alabama Coonjigger stood out because against the utilitarian purpose and the spirit of 18 that framed its neighbors on the page. Yet, its patriotism was evident. Spending more on full-page color ads, Strauss dressed Tombo in red, white, and blue. But I want to suggest even more so that Tombo's service as a war toy was a vital conduit by which the alliance of state and capital, then forming around the war, was using race to express itself directly to children. According to Walter Benjamin, who wrote later amid the post-war austerity economies of Weimar Berlin and Soviet Russia, the modern industrial toy enacted what he says is a silent signifying dialogue between children with their nation. And in its barest state, the mechanical toy wore, as he says, the grinning mask of industrial capitalism itself, gaping at you, he wrote, alluringly from the mouth of a black cannon. But in this case, the nation and capital spoke to the child in the language of race. And Tombo's racist insidiousness as an agent of the wartime economy makes more sense when juxtaposed against wartime critiques of machine culture that likewise twinned figures of slavery and machinery. So for instance, in a series of blistering entries to his war diary, radical critic Randolph Bourne, a white New York bohemian, wrote against the mass organization in men and materials by state and industry into something he called the war technique. War is the health of the state, he wrote, because it automatically sets in motion throughout society those irresistible forces for uniformity, for passionate cooperation with the government. Though Bourne made the equation between the wartime state and slavery in a playful tone, finding his social set depleted because of the draft, he declared, "It is no fun being a free man in the slave world." He also found a measure of refuge during an excursion to the Hampton Institute in Virginia. Here, the service of what he called Negro slaves were the African-American college students. furnished him with an image of beloved community, quote, a unique place where everything is worth the doing and all the energy goes into living value. As a counterpoint, in Darkwater, a series of wartime essays collected in 1920 by W.E.B. Du Bois, Du Bois diagnosed Bourne's war technique as precisely a problem of race, expressed as much in a spate of violent anti-black riots in urban centers as in invisible forces of coercion. Rather than fighting to starve off starvation, Du Bois wrote, white workers in East St. Louis, massacred black people, hundreds, to guard against the threat of, quote, losing his front home in Victrola and even the dream of the Ford car. In the Fordist economy that premised freedom on machine discipline at work and enough wages to enjoy comfort at home, whites, according to Du Bois, set the emerging reality of the black industrial worker, migrants coming from southern plantations to work in East St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, against the dream of automated convenience. Yet Du Bois saw the salvation in the very forms of automation that white people so coveted, and here's a long quote by Du Bois. It is only slowly and by the utmost effort that some small foothold has been gained for the vacuum cleaner, the washing machine, the power tool, and the chemical region. In our frantic effort to preserve the last vestiges of slavery, Du Bois wrote, we not only set our faces against such improvements, but we seek to use education and the power of the state to train the servants who do not naturally appear. If Bourne spooled out a vision of beloved community around the service of Hampton's Negro slaves, Du Bois recalibrated the trope of the slave machine with a utopian hope of universal human emancipation. In fine, he asked, can we not, black and white, rich and poor, look forward to a world of service without servants? Bourne and Du Bois wrote against the immediate threat of sedition laws and the racial violence that would kill hundreds of African-American men, women, and children nationwide. But they were also searching for new foundations for American democracy in a machine age, a democracy that could seem to contain either African-Americans or machines, but not both. Indeed, both Bourne and Du Bois might have found a nightmare portrait of the machine age in of the machine age American family in a stock Christmas photo commissioned by the Byron Company around 1920. So here, underneath a decorated tree with patriotic bunting, a fake white mother, here's this movie actress Peggy O'Neill, presided over a bountiful Christmas offering of fake white babies, fake animals, fake train cars, and Tombo right at her knee. This was the post-war world of abundance and fun advertised by the incorporated toy industry. It also demonstrated the alignment of race and technology that made this machine-made world seem like a natural home for white Americans. So to conclude, if Tombo seemed to diffuse the threat, he could also crystallize its danger. As a measure of its success, Tombo emerged at least once more on the written record in 1930, when screenwriter and popular author Homer Croy promised to show readers of the North American View an amusement park from the inside point of view. Here, gravity rides, quote, jiggled and joggled the body, while park attendants stood ready at switches to blow a jet of air up a passing woman's skirts. Preying on one man who thought he'd be wise by avoiding the thrills of the barrel roll attraction, one park attendant, quote, who was just standing there, unnoticed, reached out and touched him under the coattails with an electric wand. He continues, do you remember how suddenly he thought he was an Alabama coonjigger? He jigged all over the place because it isn't fun to be touched with an electric spark when and where you're not expecting it. Do you remember how you laughed in spite of yourself? So Tombo reappeared in 1930s Coney Island, not as a toy, but as a man transformed into a toy. We can also guess, I think, that what was funny about the laugh business here was its ability to mechanize its customers by rendering them momentarily black. Tombo, in conclusion, was Janus-faced. Its child owner or doting parent might have felt like Houdini, amplifying the stature of his or her whiteness, not by escaping the symbolic constraints of modernity, but by constraining the symbolic representation of a black slave. Yet they might also have felt like Chaplin, contemplating the loss of volition that loomed not just for the factory worker, but even for the sovereign white man in the amusement park. In either case, Tombo redirected the anxieties of machine culture into the pleasures derived from the violence, the, quote, fun, acted upon the black body, domesticating the animus of southern and northern lynch mobs into playthings for children. By reanimating and containing slavery in the white home, Tombo provided top-of-the-line machine service. Thank you.
Okay. This paper is entitled Fanon's Theory of Subaltern Self-Consciousness, subtitle Political Space, Coercion, Imagination, Persona. Starts with a quote. "You right, but everything what looks good ain't necessarily good," he said, "but these is." This project is preoccupied with questions of recognition and its relation to self-consciousness. The quote above from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is extracted from a turning point in the novel, where the narrator is experiencing a moment of self-discovery. The short statement from his interlocutor, the Invisible Man's interlocutor, a street vendor selling yams, serves as a point of entry into the central question that confronts the theorizing of Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask. How can one be sure that the thing that you are observing is the thing itself and not hidden beneath veils of subterfuge that disguise reality? The possibilities that exist out of this lineup from Ellison seem to be as follows. 1, not everything that looks good is good. 2, some things that look good are bad. 3, some things that look good are good. 4, some things that look bad are bad. 5, some things that look bad are good. 6, not everything that looks bad is bad. 7, everything that looks good is bad. 8, everything that looks bad is good. 9, everything that looks good is good. And finally, everything that looks bad is bad. We have to take here as a given that this exploration lives in a world that has established aesthetic standards of good and bad that allow the outside to be taken as a manifestation of that which is inside. This essay is interested in exploring the dynamics of instances of caesura between the appearance of the thing and the thing itself, and further the relationship these phenomena have to questions of radical politics. Most particularly, this project is concerned with the question that looms most prominently in the phenomenon of Black Skin, White Mask, that of recovering identity for the black body. For the black body of Fanon and Ellison, the possibilities of recognition and misrecognition become more complicated than the 10 possibilities bounded by appearance, matching or failing to match the normative notion of the good or bad of the thing. For the black body, there's a complicated dance of recognition within the subject that reverberates through the process of coming to self-consciousness prior to submitting itself for observation by the other. The black subject first is aware of herself as negative, being in that awareness of the fact of blackness, and its place in the Western tradition sets the deck ahead of the game. This awareness of the universal marginalization of the black precludes valuation of the individual qua the individual. This is the crux of the matter with respect to the range of possibilities presented above. Individual valuation against the normative notion of what is presupposed to be good or bad allows for the potentiality of a positive outcome to this game of misrecognition. Some things that look bad are good, rather than the totalizing notion that all things that look bad are bad. Fanon, like Ellison, requires the possibility of the individual being valued as such against the grain of society's negative judgment of all similarly situated. This possibility exists in some ways as a practical substitute for a structural change that would disallow this hegemonic worldview. This longing extends to a desire for a radical shifting of the terms of self-evaluation of normative negativity, even on the part of the hegemon. Perhaps all things that look good are bad, or to be fair, some things that look good are bad. The concern for these theorists, Fanon and Ellison, in this tradition is to deal with the internal risk of self-fulfilling negativity as a result of an existential commitment to the fact of a presupposed subalternity, in the hope that fixing the inside might prepare this figure who, up until this point, has gazed only at herself through the eyes of the other to be able to confront the scrutiny of the other with the possibility of a positive outcome. Stated differently, how does the black body, as the site of notions of abject otherness, position itself for the establishment of real self-consciousness? This question finds itself in the discourse framed in Ati Sekioto's book, Fanon's Dialectic of Experience. Quoting him, "It was in this spirit that Francis Jeanson wrote that for the harried and cowering creatures portrayed by Fanon to undertake to free themselves, they must already in some sense be free regardless. This is true, but prompted by this nagging suspicion that objectivist determinism and claims for the paramountcy of subjective freedom are rival siblings. I shall look in Fanon's text for a somewhat different version of the conundrum of the upsurge of agency and narrativity in a universe from which they are allegedly exiled. The existentialist Jeanson asks, how can the consciousness of freedom be snatched from the experience of supine servitude? I would like to ask, how can meaning ever emerge from absolute contingency and the radical deed of an anchorless will? This quote I propose resonates with the theme of this conference. How indeed does a slave become human and citizen? Using this discourse as a point of departure, this project will seek to inquire into unmasking as a tool for the creation of a subject that stands ready for Jeanson's consciousness of freedom or Sekioto's meaning. Most particularly, I wish to trouble our understanding of recognition and the thought of Fanon. The point here is that before questions of recognition by the other, I wish to meditate on what the subject as described by Fanon recognizes about herself. This essay will address the meaning of 4 related terms that make their presence known from our reading of Fanon's text: political space, coercion, imagination, and persona. If we allow ourselves to imagine the black body as a space of political construction, and further, that political space and borders are themselves coercive, the hint of the language of revolutionary change that populates Fanon's narrative regarding recovery of black identity can or must be read as analogous to the radical reconstruction of political space. This presents a dilemma. If the negative content of a political space is evacuated and refilled with an alternative reality that does not alter the coercive geographic boundaries of the space, what are the prospects for radical change? Further, understanding that the black body exists as a politically constructed space of absolute othering, as it evacuates itself, where does the empty frame come to rest in a world system that remains committed to a continuation of that narrative of black subalternity? Even if you think you look good, you are still bad. The first of the terms here, political space, will be considered along with coercion. As previously described, this essay intends to consider the black body as a space that is political in its construction and its boundary. And the theorizing of Fanon is a thick concept, as exposed by Bernard Williams in his Ethics and the Limits of Possibility. The proposition here is that the black body, blackness, or in the language of Fanon, the black man, is a political being that is animated with an endless list of negative attributes. Quote, the Negro is an animal, the Negro is bad, the Negro is mean, the Negro is ugly, close quote. The Negro and the man whose skin is black are coerced into the same space, and the black body becomes a border as secure as the boundaries of any nation state. The term coercion is used here carefully. Sekioto addresses the concept in his work by appropriating the concept from Michael A. Weinstein's essay, Coercion, Space, and Modes of Human Domination. The passage from Sekioto quoting Weinstein is rendered here at some length. In a conceptual analysis indebted to existential phenomenology, he writes, and remarkably consistent with Fanon's vocabulary, Michael A. Weinstein has argued that coercion is a distinct mode of domination, and that it is an experience primarily associated with the human condition of being in space. Weinstein writes, coercion characterizes a situation when one or more persons are restrained by one or more others from using space in some way, providing that the coerced person planned to use the space in the manner that is being prevented, and the coercer expressly inhibits or intends to prevent that use. Coercion as a compulsion produces the condition of slavery in which the actions of the coerced become means to the realization of another's plan. It is necessary to note, however, that coercion as compulsion presupposes coercion as restraint. One cannot begin to compel another to use a space in a certain way unless he has already restrained the other from using space in alternative ways. At the center of the coercion is effective control of space, close quote. Sekioto is utilizing Weinstein's insight primarily to serve as a vehicle to frame Fanon's theorizing around the colony as a coercive space and its effect on the colonized mind and body. I wish to reframe the structure of the argument from Weinstein slightly to take this phenomena into account by ensuring that it keeps track of Fanon's black man as a Williamsonian thick concept and not lose her in the confusion of the colony. The black body / man in this formulation is doubly coerced. The body itself has been relocated to a geographic space that controls its movement. That body is further framed as itself a coercive barrier to real self-consciousness, read as a notion of positive existence, and then restricts the imagination as well as physical movement. Fanon's introduction is succinct on this point, quote, the white is confined in its whiteness, the black in its blackness, close quote. This essay means to foreground this blackness that serves as the prison for the black. More carefully considered, the claim of the black body as boundary as well as cause and effect of this blackness requires careful attention. The argument here is that blackness becomes at time 0 a thing of irreconcilable negativity. At time 0 + 1, things that are black become cloaked in the negativity of blackness. At all times in the future, the notion of the black, now veiled in blackness, is read as negative. Fanon speaks to this construction both in his debt to temporality and its construction in the text under consideration. Quote, the architecture of this world lies in temporality, and the black is a black man. That is to say, he has been established through a series of aberrations to a universe from which he must be extricated, close quote. For Fanon and his theory of subjectivity, it is the imagination that serves as the center of conflict, the third term that interests this essay. The imagination of the black man is that which, I'm arguing, finds itself constrained in the prison of blackness. This notion allows us to recast our evolving question that has grown out of Sekioto's evolution of Jensen's query. Imprisoned thusly in a subjectivity that is radically bounded within a framework that is designed to limit possibility, from where does the subject garner the imaginative power to will an alternative to this abject status? Rather than imagine his way to a new reality, the prescription provided by Fanon imagines threats, many of which are all too real and the very goals themselves of the black man. Quote, the black man wants to be white, close quote, Fanon tells us. What Fanon imagines at this time is deleterious effect of the personas the black man adopts in order to become white enough to satisfy a desire for unbounded consciousness. This brings us to the final term, persona. It is here that Hannah Arendt's On Revolution provides a framework around which we might understand this question by relating it to what I choose here to label the Franco-Haitian Revolution and the central concern of the continental theater's terror, hypocrisy. Arendt in chapter 2 of the text is preoccupied with the terror. This linkage is important to this essay because I wish to analogize Fanon's theory of subjectivity, that of Robespierre and the Jacobins. Arendt's formulation is quoted here. Quote, the profound meaningfulness inherent in the many political metaphors derived from the theater is perhaps best illustrated by the history of the Latin word persona. In its original meaning, it signified the mask ancient actors used to wear in a play. The mask as such obviously had two functions. It had to hide, or rather to replace, the actor's own face and countenance, but in a way that would make it possible for the voice to sound through. Without his persona, there would be an individual without rights and duties, perhaps a natural man, that is a human being or homo in the original meaning of the word, indicating someone outside of the range of the law and body politic of the citizen, as for instance a slave, but certainly a politically irrelevant being, close quote. This formulation becomes devilishly complex for the theorizing of Fanon. 1. Fanon's black subject at its ontological level is a wholly political being whose subjectivity has no political relevance except its irrelevance. 2. The black figure cloaks herself in a series of masks/personas to hide this political irrelevance. 3. By stripping away these masks or personas, the figure in Fanon's formulation must necessarily be left as the foundational figure, having achieved nothing except the reification of political irrelevance in the absolute nature of its political construction as always already marginalized. It is this problem that confounds Fanon and turns him to Hegel for a solution. Fanon's account of subaltern self-consciousness as advanced in Black Skin, White Mask is heavily influenced by his reading of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. Fanon's engagement with the phenomenology was focused on those elements of the text that he presupposed as useful. Irene Genzender's Franz Fanon, A Critical Study underscores his point. Quote, 3 elements dominated Fanon's discussion of Hegel, which was limited to an analysis of the section of the phenomenology on Lord and bondage: recognition, reciprocity, and struggle. This is provocative in several senses, most prominently for this work in that a native of the formerly enslaved islands of the French West Indies would immediately find the logic of Kojève's reading of Hegel tantalizing. Kojève's reading of the dialectic explicitly requires a positive fulfillment of the encounter to be the sine qua non of self-consciousness. Kojève's Origins of Self-Consciousness is located in the dialectic of Lord and Bondsman, and the argument advanced here is that this idiosyncratic reading of the text becomes the centerpiece of Fanon's understanding of the dialectic. By acknowledging the presence of Hegel in the thought of Fanon, we must, I argue, then acknowledge the Franco-Haitian Revolution and Hegel's complicated relationship with it as a paradoxical insight that affects the young Fanon's theorizing on black subjectivity. This move is performed under the terms of a thesis that proposes Fanon's thought/philosophy is engaged in its own dialectic with that of Hegel within the context of a specific human experience. Hegel in the phenomenology of spirit applies his tool to the Franco-Haitian Revolution in order to make sense of its excesses, advances, and failures. Circuitously, the tool itself is derived from an observation of the events that it is then employed to analyze. Fanon applies the tool to the lived experience of the black man. The question that drives this inquiry meditates on the implication of Hegel's theory of recognition being framed against the tumult and chaos of the Franco-Haitian Revolution and finding itself reframed for the project of black self-making. At the writing of Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon was a decade from The Wretched of the Earth, where he turns the tool of Hegelian self-consciousness on the colonial state. Here he is applying its logic to the individual. Fanon overtly engages Hegel in the phenomenology in Chapter 7, Section B, The Negro and Hegel, and there in the opening moments of the narrative clearly defines the problem that he confronts. Following what he understands of his reading of Hegel, Fanon asserts, quote, man is only human to the extent to which he tries to impose his existence on another man in order to be recognized by him. As long as he has not been effectively recognized by the other will remain the theme of his actions. It is that other being in whom the meaning of his life is condensed, close quote. Here we see the clear debt that Fanon's understanding of the phenomenology owes to Kojève. I wish to provide here axiomatically, in homage to the constraints of time, 3 lines of bearing to steer us to the conclusion of this essay. They are as follows. 1, Fanon has absorbed the fact that he can only reach self-consciousness through the recognition by an other, and that it is facilitated through an act of imposition of will or violence. 2, the actor who is engaged in this human-to-human activity is revealed not to be a man and must struggle to or from a zone of non-being from which to launch his recovery. And finally, 3, consciousness, or in Hegelese sense certainty for this actor of color is devoid of Hegel's being for it of this in itself, which unfortunately means that he is only aware of himself for himself from the perspective of another. Based upon this triangulation of the ontological position of Fanon's black subject as it enters the list for the Hegelian combat of recognition, the figure we are confronted with would be known by the Jacobins who informed the phenomenology as the hypocrite. The claim advanced here is that Fanon, in his adoption of the Hegelian dialectic, is approaching the eradication of the white masks that shield his black skin in the same way that the Jacobins exposed hypocrisy. Hannah Arendt's On the Revolution again is helpful on this point. The momentous role that hypocrisy and the passion for its unmasking came to play in the latter stages of the French Revolution is a matter of historical record. The revolution, before it proceeded to devour its own children, had unmasked them, and French historiography in more than 150 years has reproduced and documented all these exposures until no one is left among the chief actors who does not stand accused or at least suspected of corruption, duplicity, and mendacity, close quote. Fanon's black subject looks upon itself and sees it doubled, but this is the Hegelian account of doubling in form, not content. Fanon's subject does not see part of itself within its negativity. This subject is static, moribund, completely defined by the other, and the desire to remove these layers of hypocrisy drives the subject to examine, re-examine, twist, and gaze at every angle and facet of its being to lay bare instances of contradiction that in fact only prove to entrench further the central tension. Remember, the black is not a man, Fanon cries. There is nothing Fanon, through his Hegelian lens, finds to like about this self. Fanon's figure is dialectically opposing her own identification of the treasonous mendacity of her own perception of the self. He cannot be more clear. Recall the third of the lines of Bering proposed, quote, consciousness of the body is solely a negating activity. It is a third-person consciousness, close quote. The consciousness of the body that is only negating is the consciousness of the self for itself and is the product of its existence by proxy. Further, we should not lose sight of the consciousness as negating rather than negative. Negative consciousness is a fixed quantity. Negating consciousness is a pathological process of continuous deconstruction. Fanon finds that as the masks are being removed, the layers that are effaced, the personas ultimately do not reveal the pristine subject that was the goal of Jacobinism and Hegel's self-consciousness. Fanon finds that his project perhaps exposes at its completion a subject that is still insufficiently prepared to engage in the dialectic of recognition. Perhaps the black subject is at its core the result of a profound construction of marginalized existence. I wish to be careful here in what I'm proposing, linking Fanon's project of subaltern self-consciousness to Robespierre's reign of terror. The juxtaposition of the two figures, I believe, is essential to a clear understanding of what is at stake when the Hegelian phenomenological tool is applied to the individual subject. The intellectual genealogy proceeds as follows. Robespierre conceptualizes his virtuous terror from a left reading of Rousseau's general will and the notion of the enemy. Hegel, we have seen, is observing the exposition of Robespierre's radical reading of Rousseau in the continental expression of the Franco-Haitian Revolution. Kojève provides his insight into the thought of Hegel that becomes a central text for the intellectual community that Fanon enters in post-war France. The argument is not that Fanon is engaged in his own conscious brand of Jacobinism as a product of some nostalgic or uniquely Francophone indebtedness to Robespierre. It is that both Fanon and Robespierre are children of the Enlightenment, and at the center of this thought is a necessity of replacing hypocrisy with reason. This, for Robespierre, becomes a dizzying array of laws, each more specific and contradictory than the last, in an effort to provide a framework for which to measure an individual to uncover the presence of counter-revolution. Fanon, for his part, through a systematic approach of deconstruction in his text, worries over every aspect of the black man's engagement with the white world. For Fanon, the counter-revolution is exemplified by a psychopathology that is at its most basic level self-hatred. Both men are fundamentally concerned with identifying the enemy that Robespierre appropriates from Rousseau. The concept of the enemy is obviously central to this project. Rousseau proposed that, quote, only in the presence of the enemy can such a thing as the nation one and indivisible come to pass. St. Jude was of the opinion that politics, as he understood it as a vehicle for the national unity, was a unique providence of international relations. All other human relations as such constitute the social, close quote. It is necessary here to briefly unpack the implications of this notion of the omnipresent internal enemy that is locatable in what would be characterized as the personal desire of every citizen versus the amorphous figure of exception that is accounted for the sum total of individualized interest to be netted against the general interest to arrive at the general will. The proposition forces us to consider that Rousseau embeds an ethos of paranoia on the part of the state with respect to the people who make it up. The state in this account must constantly be on guard against the accumulation of individual wills that construct themselves into an oppositional posture to the general will that might threaten its hegemony. The only possible solution to this problem is the constant identification of these individual wills that most effectively hide themselves in plain sight behind a mask that obscures the true intent. It is this formulation the direct descendant of the totalizing logic of the general will, that grants Robespierre intellectual purchase for the reign of terror. What Fanon has unveiled is the pernicious presence of the worst form of hypocrite, the figure whose mendacity extends to hiding the truth of the self from the self. The search for the enemy within the hearts of putative citizens that turned Robespierre's reign into the reign of terror, seeking out next to face the guillotine in the Fanonian world, is seeking to execute the self in order to provide a clean subject for a new beginning. Thank you.
My question is for Christopher Dingwall. The first slide that you showed, I think, showed a toy which was manufactured by a German, if I am correct.
Yeah.
So, was these toys marketed in Europe?
Yeah, like, I mean, this point might have got lost towards the end, but the biggest toy manufacturers were in Germany up until the First World War. So what happened, it's still the same patent. It's a US patent. A US inventor designed that toy, and, you know, a lot of the business history here is a little hazy just because the records aren't found, but what I imagine is that the toy was made in the United States, but probably distributed in Germany, where there was a bigger market. So yeah, there was an international market for this toy as well that I don't talk about.
As I listened to the presentation and been to a lot of Black slavery conference and what happened in history, and so I'm just thinking of it was claimed that the peoples see themselves as not good because you start off with good and bad and good not so good, and so when you look at race, I think Black folks at some point feel as though they wish they was white, and from that perspective, how can society change that thinking of where they feel as though they're inferior to other people?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, you've better than I articulated the central problem, right? I mean, that's Fanon's question. I mean, he's asking how, without total societal change, right, where everything becomes what it's not currently, how can you exist in a society that already thinks that you're somehow other? And he's working through these kinds of problems, and I don't think that we have a complete resolution of that question even now, right? It's this question of what do we mean by revolutionary change? And I think that's why the French and Haitian revolutions are helpful here, right? Because everyone wants to talk about revolution in terms of the French Revolution, but nobody really wants the mess that it causes, right? And so when you think about how we would restructure the thinking of the Black subject completely without completely destroying the society, you run into a very difficult proposition. And I don't think we have an answer to that. Much of the work that I think that's going forward is to try to develop ways in which we can understand society as it exists and society and how individuals express themselves within that society. Go ahead.
I just want to follow up with what else I know. When I read Michelle Alexander's book, right? So, to me, I feel as though they found a way to still to mass incarceration, to discriminate for people of color, and they found this new Jim Crow way of dealing with these problems and keeping this. I heard someone say it was as a machine, keeping this machine oiled up and greased up and keeping it moving, and I just would like to figure out how you can break that machine, just tear it down and bring up something, bring a brand new machine to educate our people to make sure they get the right chances that everyone else in life should have.
Yeah, that was the problem that I talked about W.E.B. Du Bois during the war, and he thought the First World War was going to be like a revolution like this, where by participating, but not only participating with the state, but also fighting against the Germans, the black soldier could help, foment real change. And he ended the war completely disillusioned. He was completely marginalized himself, but also, just saw the violence, not only the second-class treatment of black soldiers within the army, but also the violence against black workers at home that were, constructing munitions and things for the war effort. And he sort of thought, he said, like you're saying, is, what has to change? One way to change the machine is through education and through, but for him, is ultimately a problem of not only identity and changing cultural expressions, but also political economy, of changing the distribution of resources, changing the way that wealth and wages are distributed so that it's more equal. And he included this, Darkwater's an amazing book because he includes not only African American male workers, but also women and children as well. These are all people who need to be emancipated. And he really made a point of saying that, emancipation hasn't happened yet because there's still this economic inequality. And I think there's resonance for the way he's thinking in 1920 with today.
Yes.
So this question is for Chris. So just, I think you mentioned toys and how toys were, I guess, involved in the circulation of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if, like, in the contemporary period, if you're looking at the line of toys that came out with Django Unchained.
Yeah.
And what that, I guess, what the circulation of ideas that's being associated with that line of toys. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
What is the idea in those toys?
Yeah.
In some ways, it's so unsurprising that happened, that, that marketing effort made slaves into dolls again. But, what is the idea? I mean, it's, I think it would have to do, the message would be something about the availability of a certain kind of blackness that Django Unchained is about, which is very much about style and about a certain kind of swagger. That's Tarantino's way of looking at slavery. Gets sold. But it's, I think, I haven't really thought about this very much, but I think the way this works out in the present day, I haven't thought about the Django toys very much, but I have thought about other ways in which race and technology is sort of being, keeps on being entwined. And I'd say another example to point to is the Tupac Shakur hologram that came up, and just sort of how the black body, to think of it as a site of political construction, keeps on being available for to portray and perform different kinds of futurity, different kinds of ways that bodies in late capitalism get commodified and derealized and dehumanized in these ways. And by making it in the body of a dead black rapper, it sort of makes it more palatable than if it was Elvis or somebody. I mean, I think it's just a curious moment. So the Django toys, I'd say, are of a more banal kind of expression of this, just like marketing, just commodification of blackness. That sort of extends the kind of stylization of slavery that was in Django itself.
Time for one more question.
I mean, I'm very curious as to how you see what is the slavery that these toys reanimate?
Mm-hmm.
That would be my question. And to me, it's very interesting because it seems to me that what's going on is, as Fred Moten would say, that blackness post-abolition still bears the trace of the commodity, right? And there's something about packaging and marketing things through blackness that, you know, makes people, I don't want to say want to buy them, but there's something about the relationship between commodity and blackness that's being
Yeah.
reanimated here.
Yeah.
And I can't quite formulate my question.
No, I think that-
what is the slavery that's being?
Yeah, that's the right question. I mean, in some ways, it's not. What's so insidious about it is that it's not, you know, reanimating the slavery that was on plantations in the antebellum. It's reanimating a different set of coercions, and I think it's doing two things. On one hand, it's sort of, again, like you're saying, again, appropriating blackness to support a different kind of economic regime. You know, it's not slavery; it's a different kind of corporate industrial capitalism, global capitalism. The other hand, but what I also want to say is that, you know, it's sort of making the kinds of different sets of, I could call it coercive relationships, but certainly different sets of relationships that change the nature of how we would think of freedom, not only for black people, but for all people. When you buy a vacuum cleaner, when you own a car, you're no longer the same kind of body that you were before. How does this read as freedom? I mean, it seems like you're, to be a modern person, you take on all kinds of risks and enter in all kinds of different relationships with the state, with the economy, with the market than we ever did before, but it still reads as freedom. And I think race here, the way that you can displace those kind of anxieties onto a form of a nostalgic version of racism, ends up being a very powerful tool to naturalize capitalism.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so